Now it's not about denying climate change, but trying to figure out who is responsible. So again, there is a shouting match because people who emitted a lot may say, well, it's not our fault, and people who didn't emit in the past but are emitting now because they're trying to grow economically may say, well, but you have been emitting for much longer. So it's saying it's all their fault, and both sides are doing it. It's not just rich countries and poor countries, but it's rich countries and developing countries whose economies want to grow rapidly, and only way you grow is by having a lot of energy, and that energy still mostly comes from fossil fuels. That's what rich countries say about India and China, that it's their fault, and what India and China say about rich countries, that it's all their fault. They're both kind of right. In recent years, China has emitted by far the most CO2 of any country, and India is rapidly moving into second place. It's no wonder, with all the people who live there in these countries, billions of people. But say China and India over the past 150 years, but over the last 150 years, other countries have emitted far more CO2 because they started the industries much earlier. It's their CO2 that's causing global warming now because it has accumulated over these years, and as we know, it stays there forever, so it keeps on accumulating. It's like a bunch of children having a fight with 190 other children standing around and yelling, "China is right! Yeah, but your emissions are way too high as well, Russia. Yes, but you shouldn't be chopping down so many trees, Brazil. Brazil has the Amazon, right? Do something about all those factories first." But the United Kingdom started it. These same arguments take place year after year at big climate conferences somewhere in the world, where countries are trying to negotiate how to come together and reduce emissions of everybody. In 2015, maybe you were not born yet, the conference was in Paris for 2 weeks. Participants from 195 countries had lots and lots of meetings during the week to reach an agreement about how to tackle climate change. It was important for as many countries as possible to agree, because CO2 does not stop at the border. If US produces it, it will go into Canada, across the ocean into Europe, and so on. Global warming is a worldwide problem, and one that costs a lot of money to tackle, so everybody has to come together. Nobody can do it alone. How do you spread that the past fairly across the 195 countries? How do you spread this enormous cost fairly across the 195 countries? Right? Big countries and small countries, rich countries and poor countries, countries with many inhabitants and countries with few inhabitants, countries that are almost underwater and countries that might even be happy to get a bit warmer, countries with lots of hydropower and countries with lots of natural gas, countries with geothermal energy and countries with coal, countries that sell a lot of cars and countries that sell a lot of wind turbines, countries that have been pumping CO2 into the air for centuries and countries that are only starting to pump a lot of CO2 into the atmosphere. It's no wonder that they did not really manage to agree at the previous conferences in Bali and Copenhagen and Lima, Peru, and so on. But in Paris, miraculously, they all did agree, and you can see the signatures and signatures and signatures. The countries agreed on a target. In comparison to 1850, the temperature must not rise more than 2 degrees and preferably no more than 1.5 degrees. 1850 baseline was used, and that's going to be tricky because we are already at over 1 degree. We have very little room left to stop the warming and stop the CO2 and greenhouse gases from rising. And you know from the hockey stick how quickly the temperature is rising now. It will probably only be possible to reach this goal of 2 degrees C or 1.5 degrees C goal if by 2060 there isn't more CO2 being into the going into the air than the forests and oceans absorb. So what is 1.5 and 2 degrees then? That is the warming, maximum warming we want to achieve by 2100. You will be alive, your children will be alive, and maybe your grandchildren will be alive. So this is your future, and your future is something that we have to worry about. So here we are with all the fossil fuel combustion and the cows farting and burping and the energy and all the black carbon, the coal and the flying and the shipping and so on and so forth, right? So that basically means that only natural CO2 emissions will be allowed like before the Industrial Revolution. This can only happen if we completely stop using fossil energy, completely stop. And even then, whatever comes naturally has to be taken out. The negotiators also agreed in 2015 in Paris that the rich countries would give money to poorer countries so that they could switch to sustainable energy and adapt to a warmer world. So poor countries also have to stop burning coal and fossil fuels, and if they cannot do it, they need to be given help by the richer countries, and the countries, poorer countries that are suffering from climate impacts have to be given help to adapt to rising sea levels, to cyclones and to heavy rain or droughts and so on and so forth. It was a pretty good deal, you might think, but not everyone was happy. For some people, the agreements did not go far enough. 2 degrees C was too dangerous, they said. They are not happy that the countries aren't really obliged to keep to the agreements. Countries signed it, said yes, we'll do something about it, but there's nobody saying, haha, you didn't do it. So they were not obliged to do it, and if this works, it will be centuries before the old CO2 that's up already in the air, and thousands of years before the temperature has dropped again. Right? It will be, if it works, it will be centuries before the old CO2 is out of the air, and thousands of years before the temperature has dropped again. Others think we could make better use of the money to adapt to warming world, so that we already have seen changes, sea levels, cyclones, droughts, floods, pollution, that we should just start paying to adapt and deal with the changes that are already here. They think that reducing CO2 emissions is far too expensive and of too little benefit, and that we would be better off spending the money on good flood defenses, strong dikes to prevent water from coming in, and other ways to prepare for the future. That does mean that the temperature could go up by 5 degrees this century by 2100. It's hard to predict what the consequences will be, but we know it will not be good. Maybe some warming in the cold regions like Siberia will produce some benefits like growing a lot of food, but all the melting glaciers will raise sea level, and maybe it'll rain so hard that Siberia will not be able to grow anything either, or it'll get so warm that crops will just die, wilt and die. Okay, so we'll talk about people who say it's not the first time. Well, we already talked about climate changes over the history of the earth and said yes, it's not the first time, but we were not around when dinosaurs were wandering around in the Arctic Circle with all those warm temperatures, and in the south near Antarctica or Antarctica, human beings were not around. We have been around mostly in the last 10,000 years, becoming so populous and so technology oriented and so on, and we have not seen a warming that is more than half a degree centigrade, and even that little warming caused many civilizations to disappear during the Holocene. So we must worry about the consequences, potential consequences of warming too much. Okay, so it's not just about how much warming is safe, but it is about what risks will come with it and what we must do to avoid the risk. Okay, so we'll come back and talk about people who say, it's happened before, it's not the first time, because they are being a little bit ignorant about whether we will have survived such warmings in the past or not. Okay, we'll talk about a climate scientist called Paul Crutzen and see what he had to say about this whole thing. Come back and we'll discuss a bit more. We are very close to finishing this book, ending this book with this podcast and one more. With this chapter and maybe one more. Okay, so come back, children.